get started. If from time to time I make kind of a strange face, it's just I've got a twinged my back tweaked a few days ago, and so it's starting to improve, but from time to time I do something and it reminds me that my back is still a little ginger. So if you see me making an odd face, it's not how I normally look. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Any questions, any comments from what we talked about in the last session before we go ahead? Okay. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, when I think about all the different types of creatures that live on planet Earth, it soon becomes evident that we live on a planet where there's some pretty weird and odd and bizarre creatures, right? And some of these odd, bizarre creatures are kind of disgusting. Some of them are a little cute, but they all, at least to me, are fascinating. And one of the things I like to do when I've got a few minutes here and there are go to these websites where they list like the 25 most bizarre creatures on planet Earth and just spend some time reading about the biology of these creatures. And that always leads me to the question, why would God create a world where there are these such odd, unusual, and bizarre creatures? I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but you're going to think about it right here in just a minute. And I thought it would be fun to show you 6 creatures that are at the top of my list of those creatures that are kind of odd and bizarre that I find to be interesting for whatever reason. This is one of them. Do you know what this is? It's close. It's a sea pig, which is actually related to a sea cucumber. Sea pig. And it's actually related to a sea cucumber, and it's located, it's actually one of the most dominant species in what's called the abysmal ecosystem. What I mean by abysmal is that's the part of the ocean floor that's the deepest. And these creatures move around on these little leg-like structures, and they've got these suction cup or these suction devices that suck up debris on the ocean floor. So they eat debris off the ocean floor, but there are these pictures of like a whale carcass at the bottom of the ocean that's just literally covered with thousands and thousands of these sea pigs just consuming the debris. Here's another creature. This is called the red-lipped batfish. All right, now, be honest. If you could give that thing a kiss, wouldn't you do that? I mean, just look at those lips, right? This is a fish that lives on the seafloor off the Galapagos Islands. And it actually can't swim, or it's a very poor swimmer. It makes its way around using its fins as kind of like modified legs. It's actually a predatory fish, believe it or not. I'm not quite sure how it...
Why is it called a fish if it can't swim?
It's a fish. It's got gills, yeah. Okay, here's one. This is called the pink fairy armadillo. So that's found in the deserts of Argentina. Now, as cute as this creature is, you can't actually have it as a pet because for whatever reason, as soon as this creature is removed from its natural habitat, within days it'll die, and nobody quite knows why that's the case. Okay, here's one. This is called the star-nosed mole. It's about the size of a hamster. It lives in the wetlands of the northern part of North America. And it's about, the size of a hamster. It's blind and will tunnel around and eats insect larvae and insects. And actually, this nose has these 25 appendages, and distributed among those appendages are these hair-like organs called Elmer's organs that actually give it a heightened sense of touch and smell. All right, probably my favorite. This is called the bird-dropping spider. And this particular creature is found in the coastal areas of Australia. And it's a master of mimicry. It looks like bird poop, and that keeps predators away for obvious reasons. And quick little joke. What did one bird-dropping spider say to the other?
Look out.
You look like crap today. So anyway. All right, a combination of a junior high humor and a dad joke. So you put that together, that's what you get. But anyway, this spider also emits pheromones that will attract particular moths. So it builds at night a web that then it will emit these pheromones that will attract moths that it will then use as a source of food. This is called the thistledown velvet ant. It's found in the desert southwest of America. And it's actually not an ant, it's a wasp. And the females can't fly, but they are known to have one of the longest stingers of any wasp species. And the thistle structure is actually meant as a warning device to keep predators away from this particular creature. So we live in a world where there's some pretty odd and bizarre creatures, right? And for me, my question is, after I spend some time in just, enjoying these creatures, is to ask the question, well, why would God create a world with these kind of odd, bizarre creatures? What purpose could they serve? Now, clearly these creatures have a role in the ecosystem that they're part of, but couldn't God have created creatures that fit that role in the ecosystem that weren't so bizarre and odd and unusual? And believe it or not, this is actually an objection to the idea that there is a creator that's responsible for life. This is actually a bona fide objection leveled by skeptics against the Christian faith. Because the argument would be that evolutionary processes, which are unguided, undirected, that have no ultimate end goal, that evolve from existing biological systems that are co-opted and modified to produce new biological systems, where some biological systems are simply a byproduct of evolution, that kind of process would create this biodiversity that is kind of wanton, that is, that doesn't make any sense, that doesn't have any undergirding rhyme or reason, that these kind of odd creatures are exactly what you'd expect if evolutionary processes are responsible for the history of life. And in fact, there is a famous scientist by the name of J.B.S. Haldane. He actually was one of the scientists that established genetics as a scientific discipline in the early 1900s, was an outspoken atheist, and gave a lecture, and after that lecture, a woman approached him, at least this is the story, and asked him, well, what does his study about nature tell him about God? And so this is how he replied: if one could conclude as to the nature of the Creator from a study of creation, it would appear that God has an inordinate fondness for stars and beetles. And of course, what he's referring to is the fact that we live in a universe where there is a vast number of stars. And one of the objections is, why does God need to create a universe that's so vast, that's so full of so many different astronomical objects, if we are ultimately the objective, the sole purpose of his creation, the crown of his creation? And then J.B.S. Haldane brings up the idea of beetles. And his point is that there are over 100,000 species of beetles that have been discovered. And there very well may be more species of beetles that have yet to be discovered. And again, the question is, why would God create a world where there are so many different types of beetles? That just simply doesn't make sense. It's an unnecessary amount of biodiversity. And so, believe it or not, this is actually a serious objection leveled against the Christian faith. Now, one response that I would have as a Christian apologist would be to try to come up with reasons why God would create a creature like the red-lipped batfish, right? Or the star-nosed mole, or the bird-dropping spider, to come up with some kind of explanation for why God would create that kind of a creature. But the fact of the matter is it's really very difficult to come up with any kind of compelling response. But what if indeed JBS Haldane was right? What if God indeed had an inordinate fondness for beetles? What if that was the explanation? And that actually makes sense if we think about God not as an engineer, a divine engineer, creating a world where everything has its place and its purpose, but rather a God who is a creator, who is an artist, who will create simply for his pleasure, for his enjoyment in creating. That God would create a world in which he delights in that which he makes, in which his creation is a reflection of his divine artistry. What if that's the way to think about God, as an artist as opposed to as an engineer? Now, if that's the case, then you could argue that these strange, bizarre creatures that we see in the world are just simply a reflection of God's artistry, of God's frivolity as a creator, his playfulness as a creator. Now, the question then becomes, is there any kind of biblical warrant for seeing God in those terms? Are we justified in seeing God as an artist? Well, I think we are. So if we look at the Genesis 1 creation account, we see God creating in 6 different days of creation, 6 successive days of creation, right? And after each day of creation, God steps back and he says, "It is good." I almost get the picture of an artist working on this project and every so often stopping and just taking a step back and examining what he or she is producing and just taking a moment, a brief moment, to take delight and enjoyment and satisfaction in that project at that point in time, almost as if it's an artist stepping back, admiring his or her work. The end of the Genesis 1 creation account says, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. That sounds a bit like, again, an artistry to that which God has made. Now, in the original Hebrew, the word that's translated as good is tov. And tov can mean good, but it also can mean that which is beautiful or that which is made as it was intended. And so when God is looking at his work on each day of creation and saying that it is good, he's saying that that which he has made is beautiful. It's made exactly the way it is intended. Another scriptural passage that I think supports the idea that God is an artist comes from Psalm 104. Psalm 104 is a creation psalm, just like Psalm 19. Now, what distinguishes Psalm 104 is that it's a creation account, where each portion of Psalm 104 corresponds to the different days of creation in Genesis 1. There's that one-to-one correspondence. And it's a fun exercise. If you got some time this afternoon or this evening, maybe go to Genesis 1 and Psalm 104 and see if you can find that relationship between the days of creation and the different parts of Psalm 104. But here in the part that refers to the 5th day of creation, it says, "How many are your works, Lord? In wisdom you've made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number. Living things both large and small. There the ships go to and fro, and Leviathan, which you formed to frolic there." Now, Leviathan is this general term used in Hebrew that refers to large sea creatures. And so presumably this is the whales or dolphins. But the point or the purpose of these creatures is to what? Play. Simply to play among the ships. That looks to me like something I would expect from an artist, is to create creatures whose sole purpose is just simply to play. Its sole purpose is to play. So I think it's legitimate to see God as an artist. And this leads us to an argument that we can make for God's existence. Remember, we talked last session about the fact that we live in a beautiful world and that the beauty of creation tells us that God exists. It tells us about God's character and God's nature, right? And so the world around us is a pointer to God. And so oftentimes when apologists talk about the scientific evidence for a creator, they're focused on the cosmological argument. Do you guys remember that? The idea that there's a beginning to the universe that probably Hugh and Jeff talked about, right? Or they'll talk about the design argument, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow like there's no end. I love thinking about the design in biochemistry and biology. But a forgotten argument that I think is very powerful is the argument from beauty, where we look at the beauty of the world and we use that beauty in the world to make a case that there must be a creator. There must be a creator. I like this argument because this is an argument that is a very powerful argument. There's a deep-seated emotional component to that argument. We all have experienced beauty and understand how that experience of beauty can be so moving at so many different levels, at a spiritual level, at an emotional level. But also, it's an argument that's pretty easy to make. You don't have to be a scientist or a philosopher or a theologian to make this argument. And so it's a powerful argument. It's an easy argument to make. And there's actually two aspects to this argument that we'll see. Now, this is a picture of Richard Swinburne. If you're into philosophy and into apologetics, he's somebody that you want to read. He's one of the world's leading philosophers of religion. He's at Oxford University and has written a number of books making a case for God's existence. But one of the arguments that he has made is the argument from beauty. And this is how the first part of the argument goes. And it's an argument looking for the best explanation. What is the best explanation for the beauty of the world that we live in? And he says this: if God creates a universe as a good workman, he will create a beautiful universe. On the other hand, if the universe came into existence without being created by God, there is no reason to suppose that it would be a beautiful universe. Right? So his point is this, is that if God, the God of the Bible, is responsible for creating the universe, God as an artist would be expected to create a beautiful universe. On the other hand, if the universe is just a brute reality, is just a product of mechanistic forces, then you wouldn't necessarily expect that world to be beautiful. There's no reason to think it would be beautiful. Yes?
So, I'm curious, is just the fact that we know that something beautiful or ugly, like, also an argument? Like, how do we know what's beautiful if we don't have someone that planted that inside of us?
Yeah, well, we'll get to that your question in a second. Actually, in a very quick second, and then we're going to elaborate on that. So if what I present doesn't address your question, then ask it again, all right? I mean, you know, the one response to this would be beauty is relative, right? Or beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And it's not so much, but I don't think that's a legitimate objection for this reason, because though you and I may see things differently when it comes to recognizing something as beautiful, we both will recognize things as beautiful. Though we may not agree on it, we still will recognize things as being beautiful. But the second part of the argument, which I think goes to your question, which is this. There's certainly no particular reason why, if the universe originated uncaused, psychophysical law would bring about aesthetic sensibilities in human beings. In other words, if there's beauty in the world, there's got to be observers to recognize the beauty. And that as human beings, we recognize beauty in the world, right? And the question is, why? Why do we recognize beauty? If we're the product of evolutionary processes, we wouldn't necessarily be expected to see things as being beautiful. And we'll talk about why that is in a minute. That we wouldn't have what's known as an aesthetic sense or aesthetic sensibilities. On the other hand, if we are created in God's image, then we are designed to recognize the beauty of the creation and to see to see God behind that beauty. And so the Christian worldview makes the best sense of beauty in that it's what we would expect if God is creator, and it is also what we would expect if we as human beings were made in his image. Now, that leads to the question, though, and that is, can evolution explain our aesthetic sense? And it turns out that this is actually one of the most significant problems in evolutionary biology with regard to the origin of humanity. That as human beings, not only do we appreciate beauty and desire to actually spend time immersed in contemplating the beauty of the world around us, we ourselves are compelled to try to create things that are beautiful as well. And that we want people to stop what they're doing and experience the beauty of that which we have made. And moreover, we invite people to contemplate the beauty of those things that we make. And so the problem here is that this seems to be, again, a very challenging thing to explain in evolutionary terms, because not only would we not necessarily expect evolution to produce this kind of quality in us, but that this quality in us actually detracts from our survivability. It detracts from our survivability because it doesn't seem to have any useful purpose for us as human beings. Now, there are three categories of evolutionary models that make an attempt to try to explain how our sense of beauty arose in us as human beings. One of them says that our aesthetic sense is an evolutionary byproduct. In other words, that our sense of beauty has no functional purpose, and it evolved in us as a byproduct of another quality that actually contributes to our survivability. Many biologists believe that many of the biological features organisms display have no functional utility. They're just what's called an evolutionary byproduct or an evolutionary spandrel. They serve no useful purpose. They don't contribute to survivability, but that they are attached to us because they are connected to other qualities that do. Now, another category of model says that it's genetic drift that explains our aesthetic sense. That again, our ability to appreciate beauty has no real value at all, but it wasn't shaped by natural selection. It was shaped by a process called genetic drift, where there's just random genetic changes that take place in us during the course of our evolution, and that some of those changes actually produced in us a sense of beauty and a capacity to appreciate beauty. The problem with this is that with both of these models, and they're very similar, there's some subtle differences, they're similar. The problem with both of these approaches is that it doesn't take into account the fact that we are obsessed with human beings in contemplating beauty and creating beauty. In fact, we spend an enormous amount of effort trying to create things that are beautiful. We spend an enormous amount of our time immersed in contemplating the other things that people have created. And ultimately, those things that we produce as our creations, whether they are stories, whether it's poetry, art, music, and the list goes on and on, many times these are telling a story. These are telling these are giving us a fictional description of the world. And that comes at an expense. We are obsessed with doing these things, and this comes with an expense. Two evolutionary biologists write this. Aesthetically driven activities are not marginal phenomena or elite behavior without significance in ordinary life. Humans in all cultures spend a significant amount of time engaged in activities such as listening to or telling fictional stories, participating in various forms of imaginative pretense, thinking about imaginary worlds, experiencing the imaginary creations of others, and creating public representations designed to communicate fictional experiences to others. Involvement in fictional imagined world appears to be a cross-culturally universal species-typical phenomena. Involvement in the imaginative art appears to be an intrinsically rewarding payoff or an intrinsically rewarding activity without apparent utilitarian payoff. In other words, we're obsessed with creating, we're obsessed with experiencing those things other people create, and there's no survival advantage. A philosopher of biology, Mohan Mathan, said this, but why is this good from an evolutionary point of view? Why is it valuable to be absorbed in contemplation with all the attendant dangers of reduced vigilance? Wasting time and energy puts organisms at an evolutionary disadvantage. For large animals such as us, a necessary activity is particularly expensive. So in other words, our obsession with art and beauty is a detriment to our survivability. It doesn't promote our survivability. And so if our aesthetic sense is the product of evolution, a byproduct of evolution, or due to genetic drift, the cost is so expensive that you would think that that particular feature would be weeded out from us, that natural selection would get rid of that particular quality in us, not produce a quality in us that is, again, an obsession with us. Now, another category of explanations argues that our aesthetic sense is actually an adaptation, that it actually provides survival advantage for us. So the argument goes something like this. I think most of us in here would look at this and say, this is actually an incredibly beautiful setting, right? And the reason the argument goes is that why we see this as being beautiful is that in order to survive, we need to be near water, we need to be near lands that are going to be productive in terms of providing food source for us to eat. We need to be places where there's fertile ground that we can till. And so we see things that are beautiful. We see things that are beautiful because that beauty and that attraction we have to those locations contributes to our survivability. The problem is this, that there are things that we find beautiful that are actually dangerous. So here is a yellow-banded poison dart frog, and as the name implies, it's a poisonous frog. But yet, look at how beautiful that is, right? That's an incredibly beautiful creature that I think the problem is we're attracted to that creature. We're not repulsed by it, right? This is an incredibly dangerous creature. Or here is this is called the blue viper. A little bit eerie, but look at how beautiful that creature is. So some of the most dangerous creatures to us are actually some of the most beautiful creatures. So we don't and our sense of danger is in competition with our attraction to the beauty of these creatures. So this is clearly not contributing to our adaptability. Or what about this, a volcanic eruption? I've been to the Big Island a few times, and the last time I was there, which was a few years ago, the volcano was actively erupting. And so there was, these magma flows, and it was driving the state officials nuts because tourists like me wanted to see magma. And so people would get really, really close to magma, putting their lives at risk, right? Because people knew that this is dangerous, but the beauty and the awesomeness of that experience was attractive to people, right? And so this is the problem here, is that we are attracted to things that are dangerous. not just things that are beautiful, that are beneficial to us. Now, there's another, in the same category of explanations, there's another model that says, well, our aesthetic sense is connected to our desire to play, and play is very important because it's a way in which we learn. We learn about the world, we learn to recognize patterns, and that then contributes to our survivability. The problem with that is that we continue to pursue aesthetic activities far beyond our formative years. It's not just young people that produce art and music. It's everyone of every age. And in fact, there are people that invest their entire lives in trying to become highly proficient at things that have no utilitarian value, like art and music as examples. And so if indeed this was the evolutionary explanation, we wouldn't expect to see persistence in the pursuit of beauty, something that would last throughout a lifetime. In fact, the older you get, the more concerned you are about creating things about beauty.
I think to differ that art and music aren't something that we need. Like in the sense, like as a musician, I play at rest homes, and during the time of COVID, I couldn't play, and there was so much depression and like just people missed just music that was on a CD, like live music. Like it's something that's ingrained in us that we need to not be depressed people.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with you, but I think what you're hitting at is the idea that the core of our being is such that we need to create, and we need to experience that which other people create. We need to experience beauty. So yes, it's a very valuable part of who we are, so I would agree with you. But in evolutionary terms, there's no benefit that it provides to us in terms of our survivability. Does that make sense?
I don't know. There's a lot of depressed people in this world. Like I feel like that's one thing that people are being killing themselves all the time because they're depressed, and why?
Right, and I don't think we're in disagreement. Okay, it's just that from an evolutionary perspective, what determines whether a trait persists in the population is reproductive fitness. So does that trait make you more successful in terms of reproduction? And the point is that it's not that, so like there's one idea in evolutionary theory called sexual selection. In other words, natural selection is a particular trait makes you more competitive, and therefore you're more likely to survive, more likely to have a greater number of offspring. Therefore, that trait is going to persist from generation to generation, in fact, increase in frequency in subsequent generations. Sexual selection is there's certain traits that make you attractive. And so you might argue that artistic expression and music would be traits that would ensure your reproductive success. So that's one possible way you could explain our aesthetic sense, is that there's a reproductive value to, or there's a fitness value to it. Maybe it makes you less depressed, right? Or that it makes life feel like it's worth living, therefore you're more likely to reproduce. That could be the argument. The problem is that we spend so much of our effort. It's not that it in terms of producing art and producing music, that it actually detracts us away from activities we need to use to survive. So it's very easy to sit around and play a guitar all day long when you really probably ought to be out tilling the ground or weeding plants that are going to be producing food. That maybe playing the guitar might attract a mate, but do you need to be playing that guitar all day long, right? That's kind of the argument. But let's again hold that point. And again, this is again the point of Mohan Mathan. Again, it's worth reading this. But why is this good from an evolutionary point of view? Why is it valuable to be absorbed in contemplation with all the attendant dangers of reduced vigilance? Wasting time and energy puts organisms at an evolutionary disadvantage. For large animals such as us, unnecessary activity is particularly expensive. And so that's the point, that from an evolutionary perspective. But to get to your point, but why do we create? And I would argue the reason we create is because we bear God's image. We create because we bear God's image. So again, if we go back to this idea that God is an artist, and if we're made in his image, then that means that we too are going to be creators as well, that we too are going to be artists as well. And this is the point that Richard Swinburne was making, is that if we're made in God's image, then there are very good reasons why we not only appreciate beauty, but why we are compelled to produce things that are beautiful. And so this is, I think, to your point, it's a core of who we are because we bear God's image. From an evolutionary perspective, you could argue it doesn't contribute to our survivability, but because we are image bearers, we have no choice but to create because we're made in God's image. And if we can't create or experience that joy of enjoying what other people have made, then it harms us to our very soul. It's spiritually and emotionally devastating. And I think we're in agreement, but we can talk about it more if you'd like. Happy to debate that point. Now, it's worth here spending a little bit of time talking about what is the image of God. I don't know if any of you have ever thought about that. I'm sure you all have heard the idea that human beings bear God's image, right? But have you ever thought about what the implications of that idea is? And we're going to unpack that on Friday quite a bit. But if we're made in God's image, okay, what does that mean? Well, Scripture tells us that human beings are made in God's image. It's an idea that's only explicit in Scripture in one or two places. But that idea is implicit throughout Scripture. It's a very important concept in Scripture. But Scripture doesn't really clearly define what the image of God is. And so over time, theologians have debated this idea. Some argue that the image of God reflects our resemblance to the Creator, that we have certain attributes that we share with the Creator, our technical inventiveness, our capacity for abstract thought, our creativity, you might say an intellectual element to our nature. Another aspect would be our moral nature, that we recognize right and wrong, that we have a sense of justice. Another aspect would be that we recognize a reality beyond the physical material universe and that we desire to connect with that reality. And then also our capacity for relationships. This is called the resemblance view or the substantive view. Another view is the representative view. This is the idea that the image of God isn't referring to qualities that we have, but responsibilities we were given, right? That God created human beings, and because we are image bearers, he told us to multiply and fill the earth, to subdue the earth, to rule over the earth, to be stewards or caretakers of the planet. Right? And so that the image of God refers to the responsibilities that we've been given as human beings. And then last is the relational view, that the image of God refers to our unique capacity to enter into a relationship with God. That again, it doesn't reflect our capacities, but our status before God as being uniquely in that relationship. Now, these three views are not mutually exclusive. I actually hold to the top view, but the top view actually subsumes the bottom views. In other words, to be representatives and to do certain responsibilities uniquely as human beings, because only human beings bear God's image, we have to have certain qualities that separate us from the rest of the creation. Or to be uniquely in a relationship with God means we have to have certain qualities that allow us to enter into that relationship uniquely with God. So I don't see these as mutually exclusive, But right now, believe it or not, among theologians, there's a very active debate going on as to what is the image of God. There's a fourth view that I think is valuable, and this is called the co-creator view. And it's a recent view developed by someone by the name of Philip Hefner. And the idea behind the co-creator view is this, that remember, when we were created in God's image, we were given certain responsibilities, right? And the idea here is that Adam was created before there was a Garden of Eden. I don't know if you knew this. He wasn't created in the garden. He was actually created before there was a garden. And then God caused the garden to grow and placed Adam in the garden to work the garden, right? And then Eve was created from his side. But Adam in that garden was learning lessons where God intended Adam to take the order that was in the Garden of Eden, which is a sacred space, and spread it throughout the world. Where God created the world, but it was an unfinished creation. Where the Garden of Eden reflected the final form of the creation, and that it was up to Adam to complete that work. And so he was to multiply and fill the earth, and to subdue the earth, to rule over the earth, to be a steward of the planet, but in doing so spread the order in the garden to outside the order, so that not only were we to be co-rulers with God and co-caretakers of the planet with God, but we were to be co-creators. And so this is the concept. We are to create on behalf of God. We are co-creators just as we are co-stewards and co-rulers. Because we possess God's essence in the image of God, as the crown of his creation, we become partners with God. We aren't passive subjects of God's creation, but we have become active participants in which we create new things. As image bearers, we have been imbued with the cognitive and rational capacity to create. We have also been imbued with the will and the desire to create. We are compulsive creators. We have a creative spirit within us. And so the reason why we create tells us something fundamentally about who we are as human beings and what it means to be someone who bears God's image. The image of God is the foundation of Christian ethics. Because every human being bears God's image, every human being is sacred. Every human being is sacred because every human being images God. Every human life has infinite worth and value. And this is the foundation of Christian ethics. It's the foundation of the gospel, that we can uniquely enter into a relationship with God because we bear God's image. Right? And so Jesus, when he took on the form of a human being, is the ultimate expression of what true humanness should be. It's the ultimate expression of the image of God. But that Jesus could take on the form of a human being because, as God, because human beings bear God's image. But it also is an explanation for why we are creators, why we are compelled to create. And so when we create, we are, I would submit to you, entering into a distinct and unique type of fellowship with God as co-creators. When we create, whether it is a painting, a sculpture, if we're writing a piece of music, playing a piece of music, if we're writing a story, writing a poem, if we are designing and erecting a building, if we are engaged in an investigation of nature through science, we are creating. When we develop a scientific theory, that is an act of creation. Everything we do as a human being ultimately is an expression of our creativity. And so the idea is that we are the fullest we can be as a human being, and it's the fullest expression of the image of God when we are in the act of creating. And because God is a creator, when we create, it's a special type of fellowship we enjoy with the Creator because of that. So when we think about the idea of God as an artist, to me, I'm deeply attracted to a God who is a God that will create things for frivolous purposes. It makes me love God all that much more to think that there's a playful element to what God is doing in the creation. And it allows me to enjoy those features of creation even that much more. But it also reminds me again of who I am as an image bearer as well. All right. I'm curious. What is your name? I'm sorry. You probably told me and I missed it.
Lexi.
What's that?
Lexi.
Lexi. Okay. All right. So does that answer your objection? It's a very great question that you're asking. So good job.
I didn't quite realize how hopeless the evolution is. Like, as you're describing it, it sounds like that you're no more than an animal. There's no real reason for living outside of just surviving. What's the point?
Yeah, I mean that is it in a nutshell. It's all about reproductive success or fitness, which is kind of a combination of the ability to survive and reproduce. Anybody else? Thoughts, comments, questions? All right. Well, why don't we take, it's not going to be quite 15 minutes, but why don't we take a 12-minute break, and then we'll plow ahead.